Welcome to everybody. Welcome to Maja House, Amritsar's innovative literary and cultural space. We would have loved to have you here in person, but since Corona's been a spoilsport and hasn't allowed any of that for the last 1.5 years now, this is the best we can do. But you're very, very welcome. This evening, we have for you Ranjit Hoskote, one of India's most well-known, outstanding contemporary voices. Ranjit is a poet, cultural theorist, and curator with 7 collections of poetry that include Vanishing Act, Central Time, and Jonah Whale. Hunchprose, which we are going to be discussing a lot more later today in the evening, is a stunning collection, and it's a stunning looking book as well. That talks of many crises that confront humanity, identity and home, climate change and environment degradation, the pandemic, the many wars and conflicts that seem to engulf us from all regions, and the most horrific news that keeps flowing into our sitting rooms as we watch television or listen to the news. From that very first speaker, Sidi Mubarak Bombay, who's searching for an elusive, ever-shifting home, to that gray bird, which is lost in Pigeon, to the town where you ask for directions in whispers, and then to the market. Each poem here speaks to us urgently, and it asks that we pay heed because there is danger and there is fear of loss. Thank you very much, Ranjit, for being here with us today and for sharing your precious words with us and with all your readers. I'd also like to say thank you to Shiny Anthony, co-founder of the Bangalore Lit Fest, who introduced us over email. And I'm so glad that she did that because we were able to invite you here today. Maitri, who's here with us, is our moderator for the evening. She's a poet and writer. She's based in Bangalore, and she also has 4 books to her credit. She teaches poetry and design at NIFT, Bangalore, and she is currently involved with the Academy of Motion Pictures for their oral history project as a translator. I don't want to take any more time because we must plunge into this conversation. And like I said, I'm really looking forward to all of these readings. So over to you now, Maitri.
Thank you, Preeti. As you know, welcome everybody to this wonderful, what looks like is going to be a wonderful evening in celebrating and discussing Ranjit's wonderful book. Like Preeti said, it looks so beautiful, both the cover and it's, as I know, it's beautiful inside out. Many congratulations again, Ranjit, for yet another wonderful book. Preeti has, of course, wonderfully summarized his scholarship and his many works, but I would like to introduce him from a poet's perspective. So I first started reading Ranjit a couple of years back, and incidentally, I started reading his pieces on art to begin with, and then graduated to poetry because art interests me as well. So, and over the years, you know, his poems and his books, you know, while reading them, 2 in particular come to my mind, which have, you know, stayed with me because of the sheer magnificence of the work. One is Jonah Whale, and the other is Ailala, the poems of Lal Ded in translation. And now, of course, we have Hunchprose. You know, as a poet, you know, what you first notice, I think, when I read him as a poet myself, and when you first notice his precision with words, and it in fact reminded me of Kolatkar, a huge Kolatkar fan, and it reminded me of Kolatkar. And it's as if, you know, he knows exactly where to place each word in a poem and bring about the entire imagery. Other than that, there's his wonderful love for language, which he brings in, and placed throughout the poetry at various levels, and in layers. And what he does very interestingly, I think, is bring about the cultural subtext of these languages which he inhabits, and brings them to his poetry. As a result of all these things, culminating together, his poems require a rather intellectual, attention from the reader, without which I think his poetry is, not as well enjoyed, perhaps. And that is also a unique perspective in many ways, because, that you don't see that in many Anglophone poets. And as a result, I think he has firmly established himself in the map of international poets whom we have looked up to, for a while now. And whenever I pick up a book of his or a poem, I've always thought to myself, here is a poet who really knows his place in history, or at least poetic history, at least. So without further ado, let's really dive in and ask the man himself about the journey of Hunchprose. Ranjit, I'll begin by asking you about the experience of bringing out this collection, especially at a time like this. I know you said that you started the book around 2019, but I'm sure it went on, and before the actual chaos of the pandemic began, I'm assuming there was a sort of silence, which may have been a precursor to the release of the book. So could you just take us through the conditions under which the book came about?
Sure. But let me first thank both you, Maitreyi, and Preeti for your very warm and generous and gracious words of welcome and your response to my work, which I'm just deeply moved by. And I'm very happy to be here with all of you at the Maja House platform. I do indeed wish that we could physically have been in Amritsar.
Yeah.
This is as good as it gets. And there must be some telepathy at play, because this is pretty much my favorite place now to sit and do Zoom sessions. And it only occurred to me now that this work up here, which you can't see because of the glare, has deep connections with your part of the country. It's a work by Vivan Sundaram from a series that he did around his aunt, Amrita Shergill, and his grandfather, Umrao Singh Shergill. So as I speak to you, these figures from very close to where many of you are with us. And I just find that very, very strange, telepathic, moving, because for me, poetry is something that is a response in the moment to the urgencies of the moment, but it's also nourished by those who've gone before across the arts. So I always find myself going back in a space of dialogue, in a space of humility, to people who've been there before, who've had these explorations, who've worked with similar urgencies, other questions, who've worked with questions of craft. So poetry for me is both moving outward and forward into our time, but also a constant moving back and retrieval. And working on Hunchprose was not different in that sense. You're right. I mean, the book was written with a certain kind of intensity across 2019 and completed in 2020, early in 2020. And in a sense, it picked up from where my previous book, Jonah Whale, left off. So I know it sounds strange to think about books of poems as if they were novels in a sequence, but increasingly I found that a fruitful way of thinking about how one actually works on a collection of poetry. What is it that brings to it a certain kind of unity, if not a thematic unity? What is it that you're exploring? So in Jonah Whale, I was, as some of you might know, thinking about histories of the ocean, the kinds of transcultural connections that have made us who we are, nourished us through plurality, through difference. And to me, that is both a matter of aesthetic delight, because I'm wonderfully delighted when I think about this kaleidoscopic being that all of us have. But it's also a political commitment, because we are threatened on all sides by forces that want to narrow us down, that want us to be boxed into, traps of region, language, religion, ethnicity, caste, gender, whatever it might be. And I think that as artists across the arts, whether it's poetry, painting, theater, film, uh, we need to bear witness to this kaleidoscopic nature of who we are. So that to me is also a political conviction. Hunchprose very specifically also arose as a series of responses to things that we were all going through at that time. I think all of the events that took place in Kashmir, for instance, they were a very strong impetus for some of these poems, and that actually surfaces in a number of them. There was also something that I've been very preoccupied with, as many of us have been, the ecological catastrophes that have really been building up across the last decade in particular. Also the question of how I, as someone who loves animals and have always thought about the possibility of communication across species, how do I think about sharing this planet with other species? What are the ways in which we might do this? So there were a number of these questions, each one approaching a certain pitch of urgency. So what we've been through over these last 16 to 18 months, actually under the rubric of a public health crisis, all of these other questions have also been with us. And I think that as a poet, certainly, this is something that I do want to bear witness to. Sorry, a long answer to a very precise.
No. That was required, I suppose. And apologies for disappearing. I had a slight technical glitch. Ranjit, I'd like to start off. Preeti kept nudging us that we should have more poetry readings from Ranjit. So I'd love to hear you read out Sidi Mubarak, Bombay. I think all of us really love that poem, and also tell us a little bit about the journey of the poem and what you've done so interestingly in the poem, I think, is, you've taken an international traveler, if I may call him that, his journey and focused it from the angle of Bombay. And the poem also showcases, snippets of Bombay that many of us, even Bombayites, don't know about, So if you could, stress on that and of course, read your poem.
Sure. Thanks so much. I'll read the poem and then maybe I'll talk about the characters in it. So it's called Sidi Mubarak Bombay. Sidi Mubarak Bombay lived from 1820 to 1885. It's very much a 19th century figure, but belongs to a part of the 19th century that is usually under the radar. And I'll say more about that. Yeah, so the poem goes like this. I should go home now, but I forget where that is. A child, I was sold for a length of cotton and hammered into a link in a chain of caravans. Taken across the sea in a dhow, the Arab slavers had been generous with the whip. The Gujarati merchant who bought me had a sense of humor. He called me Mubarak, blessed. Many years I worked for him in Bombay, city of opium warehouses, city of cotton godowns, city of spice stores, city of jahazis, munshis, khalasis, sarafs, bishtis, sepoys. That was the only family I knew. So I called myself Bombay. My Seth died, leaving instructions that I was to be freed. I went back to Zanzibar and built a house. In Bombay, I was a Siddhi, a man from the Zanj, a man the color of night. In Zanzibar, I spoke Gujarati, Hindustani, 2 words of English, stuttered in Kiswahili. But this new old country spoke to me in rhymes of soil, sand, river, jungle. It brought me gold, coral, also pearls. Speak, Sahib. Bwana, speak, wanted me to be his guide. Then Burton Sahib came. Bwana Burton, then Bwana Stanley. Bwana Speak was looking for the source of the Nile. So were they all. I was their compass and their sextant. With them I looked for the source of the Nile. Once we nearly died, as if the journey was cursed. Burton Sahib vomiting all the time. Bwana Speak going blind, his eyes gummy and swollen with too much dreaming. At last, Ujiji, the lake rippled from one end of the world to the other. Wide as a sea cradled in a giant's palm. God, forgive us, we tried to cross it. Bwana Speak lost his hearing. A beetle had crawled into his ear. What afrit possessed him, I don't know, but he tried to get it out with a knife. No boats large enough to cross that lake. Later, I crossed Africa from coast to coast, walked more than any other man alive, logged 6,000 miles, most of it on foot. Match that if you can, sometimes donkeys. Long after I left Bombay and went back to Zanzibar, its smells followed me. Freshly chopped garlic, fenugreek, hing, pepper, cinnamon, bombil drying in a sharp wind. Bombil, I would say to myself, sitting on my stoop, looking across the sea, rolling the syllables in my mouth. Bombil, surmai, bangra, ravas, the masala thick pungency of one fish after another would settle on my tongue. My neighbors must have thought I was chanting spells.
Wow, fabulous.
Thank you.
That kind of brings about, so many scents as if, to the poem as it were. And could you please speak about writing the poem?
Sure. You know, the impetus for the poem came to me a long time ago. In fact, I was just totally by coincidence. I just got a letter yesterday from a very fine Ugandan writer and academic, Mahmoud Mamdani, yesterday, who came across this and for obvious reasons was interested in it. So we had a little exchange about primary sources. And I told him, and I would share that with you, that I really became fully aware of Sidi Mubarak, not from the traces of him that exist, but when a dear friend of mine, the German novelist Ilya Troyanov, was working on a book on Richard Burton, the explorer. That's Burton Sahib in the poem. It's a novel that was published in 2006, Ilya's novel. It's called Der Weltensammler, the Collector of Worlds. So, and Ilya lived in Bombay at that time. So we would see each other very often, talk about the progress of the book and think about precisely these transoceanic, transcontinental connections that connect us, but these histories have sometimes been repressed. Out of all this came another book that we co-authored called Confluences, but that's another story. Okay. But why I became so fascinated with Sidi Mubarak Bombay was, one, he comes out of a history of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean, which many of us also academically and theoretically know to have existed. But when you live in Bombay and are a citizen of it, it's not something that you're very aware of. You know? We've always seen ourselves as, a cotton city, the textile trade. It took us a long time to accept that we'd also been an opium city, because that links us to historical tragedy and the suffering of others. I don't know how long it's going to take to accept that we were also involved with the slave trade and yet more suffering of others, the enslavement of people from East Africa, which is part of a larger story of the presence of people of African origin in the subcontinent. Some years ago, I remember being deeply grieved when there was an outbreak of Afrophobia here in Delhi, in Bangalore, alas, little in Bombay, all over the place. And I thought to myself, for God's sake, these people have been among us for centuries. They've been here as mercenaries, soldiers of fortune, as generals, as rulers. Right. Malik Ambar comes to mind. There's so many people. The Siddhis they are part of our story. And even today in Bombay, there are Siddhi shrines. So the idea that we could stigmatize and other people who've been part of our story, who are part of us, and there are vibrant Siddhi communities all along the West Coast. So this was something that had been playing in my mind too for a long time. So all of this converged in this very particular figure. And alongside was also this question of how do I bear witness to this narrative? Because to many of us, our understanding of this horrific commerce in human beings is really linked to the Atlantic trade. Yeah, so we tend to see things also through the perspective of American political life, where it is, for obvious reasons, a deep source of asymmetry and disquiet and justice denied. So when we think about it, how do we come to it? And this also came up in another context where I'd read the poem, and I have to say that we have other roots to this question. We've been part of the story in other ways. We have our own optic, and we need to develop it. And in a more redemptive spirit, we've gone through this long Nehruvian history of building very, very strong anti and post-colonial links with the various countries of Africa. So something that's always been very important to me is how do we continue with these entangled histories that bring so many of us together? So whilst being fully respectful of the historical specificities of people's crises, my question would be, in what way do we release ourselves towards the other? Through empathy, through affinity. So these are a number of the things that inform this poem. And also the question, just at a human artistic level, how did this man define himself? He was brought here as a child.
Yeah.
He embraced various languages here. What did that do to his sense of his own language? Which really was his own language, which really was his own home.
Exactly.
Selfhood that's distributed across countries and languages.
Yeah. And somebody in the chat box just pinged saying he was a prisoner in his own country, but free while abroad. I think that also adds to certain many dimensions of him. Now, yes, were you about to respond to that?
No, just to dwell on that, but also to talk about how it's a prose poem. And I also thought that I would work with different sorts of linguistic moments in the poem. He's referring to people in the idiom he knows from his Indian life. And it's just like, speak sahib, then connects to the African colonial idiom and then translates. There's a lot of internal translation. Then he says, Bwana, speak. And I really wanted for the sort of multiple first language interference to come into this account. So as he might have lost languages, he's also gaining others, and he's developing languages with a vibrancy that languages really show when dissimilar people come together and make languages.
Yeah. And the question of language, when you talk about it, brings me to the other rather obvious question. One can't help but notice your play with language in your poetry. I know that you've grown up in a multilingual kind of throughout your growing years. You've probably had a multilingual atmosphere, which is why when we see this Siddhi Mubarak poem as well as some of the other poems, the Indianness that you see around you somehow translates very smoothly in the English language in your poetry. There's no jarring note, which sometimes happens. What I wanted to really know is that because of your work as a translator, does that inform your poetry, or is it because you speak and kind of reside in so many languages in your mind, perhaps?
That's I think for any of us, all of us, I think these are complex questions. So let me try and tease out the three different things that came to mind. Thank you. It's a really rich and marvelous question. For one, I mean, you mentioned Indianness, and I do want us to discuss that a little, because I think we are caught between two opposite notions of Indianness. One is a top-down notion, which comes from some form of state preoccupation with Unitarian Indianness, with its official protocols, as if everybody needs to conform to this one standard idea, which has actually, I think, generated vast chaos for the last 70 odd years, because it's a futile project in a country as diverse as ours to try and have this one-size-fits-all Indianness. So all that's resulted in is immense tensions between the real difference on the ground and this imagined unity. When all the time a simple, healthy, respectful federalism was always at hand, but it's something we've always rejected in favor of these monolithic top-down solutions in culture and politics and everything else with catastrophic results. So that's one kind of the bad Indianness. The good kind of being Indian, I think, is when we appeal to our historical experience of being in South Asia. And I'm going to say South Asia because the more recent political borders achieved through much trauma tend to blind us to the fact that going back several millennia, we have much, much vaster cultural heritages in the plural to draw on, you know? So we all know this. I'm just spelling out something that is evident to all of us in our experience. So in terms of language, this also is very true to me. There's a great, real, visceral plurality to draw on. And there seems to be no good reason to not draw on that plurality. And in my own arc as a poet, I've gone from being a rather, as we all were at one point, very defensive Anglophone poet, because there was a lot of pressure on us. So, you're writing in the old colonial language, you're out of touch with Indian reality. As many academics kept telling us, we were alienated. I'm not quite sure what that word means. I'm not even sure that alienation is a bad thing. Sometimes it gives you a critical perspective. But over the years, it's simply come to me that it was no point locking myself into this kind of citadel of the Anglophone. And why would I do that when I, in fact, do have access to multiple languages? From the way I grew up, from what I read anyway, I read in multiple languages. Things I'd kept out of, for whatever reason, out of the main current of my poetry, like my fascination, lifelong fascination with music. So, you know, I mean, you very kindly said that there's a certain kind of intellectual tendency to my poetry, but for me, what's equally important is musicality, is how one approaches the condition of music. So all of these streams really need to nourish the work we do as poets or as visual artists, as theater makers. So to me, it was a simple artisanal realization that this is how it needed to be. So that's been one of my projects, certainly. Yeah.
Right.
And translation, yeah, sorry. You've really started me off my three.
No, I'd love to hear that because your translations have formed a very large part, and especially Ailala, that took up so much of your writing period from what I see, and has to have a kind of effect on what you write furthermore.
I think that's absolutely true. I think as the years have passed, I've realized that translation really does play a very, very crucial part in my poetry. Because to be a good translator, to be any kind of attentive translator, you have to be a reader who approaches the original with a certain degree of tact and humility. And you have to be prepared to be changed by what you're translating. So somewhere in the Lalla introduction, I talk about how I was broken and remade as a translator.
Right. Yeah, I remember that.
You do, yeah. Well, it's not only in relation to the text. Literally, like Rilke's Apollo says, you must change your life. So when you translate, you're also being challenged in your cultural assumptions, your worldview. So it's been vital and crucial and replenishing, because each time I translate, I feel like I'm an apprentice to what I'm translating.
Right. So you mentioned music, and your interest in music. And I remember when we spoke earlier too, I want to mention this not only in terms of only music, but in some of your poems, for example, the poem named Market, I distinctly found several audio repercussions, as if, there's a almost like a staccato beat. And there are, so many audio visual things happening in that poem, whether it's with the street, I don't really exactly recall the words, but yeah, with the sounds and what you termed as musicality of language. So we see that in a couple of your poems. So if you could elaborate on that, I know you have a deep interest in music and how that has informed your work, and in some of the poems here too. And if you could read one of the poems which
Sure.
you think,
Yeah, I could read Market actually, because you mentioned it.
yeah, yeah,
It goes like this. It's called Market, and it and it actually employs a very traditional Greek rhetorical device, which you will all recognize instantly. It's anaphora. So it's an anaphoristic. This is what brings about that sort of musicality here. Market. Never forget the salt makers. They can trap the sea. Never forget the makers of flint knives. They can split the earth. Never forget the spice sellers. They can tempt the tongue to sing. Never forget the kite makers. They can scissor the wind into streamers. Never forget the carpenters. They can build horses that breach walled cities. Never forget those who stretch hide into leather. They can craft drums that bring down palaces. Yeah, and maybe I'll read one more, which actually I don't think I've ever read this.
okay, great,
So it's called Factory Song.
wonderful.
I think we're in a section of the book which has something to do with protest and resistance. I'm going to read Factory Song. Whisper to the workers of the fourth factory. We'd never dream of letting you down. Go on designing crystal torrents to drown the world's opacities. Go on training wild Mongol horses to trample the world's complacencies. Go on carving recycled totems to shame the world's neo-tribal fantasies. But take a break at 13 o'clock. Give us a guided tour of what goes down. We'll keep it to ourselves in ones and ciphers. We'll look around with laughing eyes. If yesterday had Ganga long hair, we never really learned her proper name. If tomorrow's a siege of howitzers, we just can't wait to be blasted away. And so the iron foams and gurgles in our blood. And so we dance on roads littered with our candy skulls.
Wonderful. I love that poem. It's such a vivid imagery. Very beautiful.
Thank you. And maybe how are we doing for time? May I read one more in this sequence? Because we're talking about a certain kind of music. What's also appealed to me over time is to vary, because we're working in what seems at first glance to be not a formal metrically defined space. But when you do that, you're actually under far more pressure to
Right.
craft your tempo, to figure out what is going to hold this poem together in a musical sense.
Yeah.
So there's different kinds of musics, if you will, and this will go on too long, so I'm just going to flag and annotate. In the last few years, I've really drawn a lot on Hindustani music, not
Okay.
necessarily to translate directly, but to be informed by. But also a vein of avant-garde music, which is sometimes, I think, mistakenly called minimalism. Terry Riley, Steve Reich. So, it's just how one is able to energize oneself through transformative listening. And what I'm about to read is a simple old style beat of a certain kind. It's called Protest, and it's for a dear old friend, the artist Sudhir Patwardhan. Doesn't refer to any specific painting of his, but to a phase in his work, which was set in industrial environs and in relation to the working class, protest. Hand at the gate, fist around the stone, hand on the placard, fist around the stone, hand around the flagpole, fist around the stone, hand around the baton, fist around the stone, grasp the flint edge clarity of breath ebbing from stone.
Very nice. How are we doing on time? Are we okay with time? I think we are. We can. Yeah, I think we can take another question, right, Preeti? Yeah. So, at some point you talked of memory, and I think that's a very constant refrain in many of your poems. And there's a certain other, as if, which is hinted at. And I think a lot of the allusions in the poem also are in that direction. So it's as if, you in many ways, it's as if you marry the deep memory that you have somewhere else to, the poem that you're narrating in and describing in the present. So would you just kind of elaborate on that technique or, of yours?
Sure.
A few people have actually, when I put this up on, I was doing this on Facebook, a few people actually asked me about, this. So I thought it might be.
Sure. No, thank you for that question on memory, because it also, I think, invites us to think about how we have our own personal memories as individuals, but we are also always locating ourselves through a far larger archaeological imagination. I mean, if we are attentive to these questions and if we are willing to be surprised by what we might find
Right.
out. Yeah,
Right.
and because to a fundamental extent, the past is really never over, and particularly in a culturally fraught subcontinent like ours, things don't really go away. They're waiting there. They've been either repressed or they've been translated into something else, and you have to attend to these questions, both because they're disquiets, but sometimes also because they enrich you and replenish you what you gain. There's also the question of what your sense of being an individual poet is when you work, as I do, with something that is an extended form of the lyric poem. You have a certain kind of frame to work with, but it doesn't mean that you have to be trapped in, or that you should confine yourself only to your own private crises. I think increasingly, and as is now very evident in this time of pandemic, our destinies are tied up with the destinies of everybody else. So,
yes, completely.
So to me, the poem is also, or poetry is also a way of reaching out to the memories of others, the experiences of others. So there's a way in which you're also reaching out empathetically back into the past in an archaeological mode, but also empathetically to see how to dissolve this very tight sovereign I.
I think a couple of questions are coming in, but before we sort of wrap this up, I'd quickly like to ask something that has personally intrigued me. I think we see in a lot of your poetry, the lack of punctuation. Do you think, it's a sort of technique to let your readers digress in different ways that they might interpret the poem in various ways that they would want to, and again probably come back to where you started off with. What would you kind of say to that?
It's increasingly marked in this book. I mean, it hasn't always been the case. I think, for instance, through Vanishing Acts, Central Time, they were much more classical. But this too has come to me over a period of time, and not least through translation. Because particularly when I've been working on Mir Taki Mir or Ghalib, I've been fascinated by the way in which a language like Urdu really allows you to go into very diaphanous forms of syntax. There's things that are alluded to there are shades of meaning. You really have to go back and forth across the line for it to reveal multiple meanings. So how does one bring some of that spirit across? So this is part of the story, partly also because I'm working much more with the notion of a breadth unit. I'm not going to immediately pin it to Charles Olson's projective verse, but those notions of projective verse or the poem as an open field, it's all gone into the making of these poems. And you're right, I think it is in a way, it's an invitation to the reader to become involved in the body of the poem.
Because I remember, I think you were at the Bangalore Poetry Festival and you said something very interesting that stuck with me, and I've used it several times while writing myself too. I remember you saying there are many a times when we start writing of poetry at a stage when we mishear something, we misinterpret something and we mishear something, and a separate tangent starts off there, and we start writing from there in some beautiful middle maybe, so yeah, that's kind of a thought that crossed my mind even while I was talking of this. Okay, so shall we take a few questions, Ranjit?
Sure, happy to.
Yeah. Okay. Preeti has said that maybe we can ask another question, but okay. So somebody has said, Rumi famously said, what you're seeking is also seeking you. Did you feel a spark of recognition when you crossed over the arc of time and encountered people, places, texts? Did you feel a sense of knowing that you retrieved from ancestral memory?
Sometimes, I thank you for that question. This happened to me in some ways, I think, particularly during the long time I spent working on the Laldia translations. But that began as a revisiting of ancestral memory, which eventually became a much longer journey that had to do with also responding to the present of Kashmir. So I wasn't just on my seeking of the ancestors track. It was also knowing that the region had an exceedingly vexed present. So it meant, articulating commitments of various kinds. So did I feel that something there was reaching out to me? Yes, I did. But that was both in the past and the present. And it does happen. You do have these moments of encounter, discovery, synchronicity, when something reaches out. It could just be a line in a Nirguni bhajan that was waiting for you forever. You have that feeling when it opens out in your mind and resonates for you.
Totally. Sudeep says, your poem switches from one level of discourse to another. How do you design this paradigm?
I wish I could really design it. It depends on the occasion of the poem. I think that because I see these things as there's no single way in which this works. That said, I love the idea of design and other things I do. But when it comes to poetry, the design is very much in the moment. It's improvised within the atmosphere of an individual poem. Yeah.
I think his question comes from the fact that, when one reads your poem, especially, there's so much of a dedicated and studied, like I was saying, it's almost like precision, perhaps that's where the question comes from. So yeah, design paradigm that's an answer to that, Sudeep. Manas says, Ranjit, do you think the lack of punctuation, as I discovered while first reading Octavio Paz, also a matter of special idea of a poem where it floats on the page rather than pinned to it? Punctuations offer us grammatical,
grammatical fixities.
Yes.
Would mean ungrammatical.
Lack would mean ungrammatical. Yeah.
Manoj, thank you very much for that question. Manoj and I recently we've had public conversations and also an informal exchange at various levels. And it was when he reminded me of this that I actually took down my old Octavio Paz. I think it's some of us in a certain generation would have read the same edition, Elliot Weinberger's big Octavio Paz collected poems. And I realized with a shock that this was in fact true. This is a book I'd read years and years ago and had been at the back of my mind. I had not adopted this kind of punctuational strategy or lack of punctuation strategy for a long time. And it came back, and I love this idea that Manoj offers of the spatial idea of a poem that floats on the page rather than being pinned to it. I think it's a really beautiful way of putting it, and very true for me.
Sudeep again asks, how far is your poetry an act of cultural recovery?
Let me say that it's part of a larger, project sounds very cold-blooded, but it's a larger approach to cultural. It's part of a larger approach to cultural recovery. This might come across in a more sort of designed way in some of my essays or in the book that I mentioned, Confluences, done with Ilya Troyanov. But cultural recovery, the sense of cultural confluence definitely informs my poetry. It's certainly a key theme.
Right. Monica Banerjee says, struck with your formulation that the past does not really get over, especially in a culturally fraught subcontinent, yet in commenting that our personal memories could involve other memories too, it was cathartic. In following this route to empathy, perhaps we would be able to shed off the accusation that we invoke past from a position of bitterness.
Yeah, this is a very deep question and a deep crisis, I think. Particularly, I don't have to labor the point. We're all familiar with the multiple traumas, historical traumas that the subcontinent's gone through. But how does one work to this place of shedding bitterness, giving up resentment, and achieving some form of understanding, forgiveness? Other societies have had these experiments. South Africa with its Truth and Reconciliation Committee. I think around the 50th anniversary of the partition, there were a number of attempts to break different kinds of silences. And this will be an ongoing attempt. I think some of these traumas are far too fresh, and as I said, they're still with us. But going forward, we have to address them. The tragedy is that we have a dominant form of politics that is very happy with trauma and very happy with provoking and prompting and nurturing resentment and hatred. And this
works to their convenience.
Yeah.
Sujit says, were there particular music that you cannot imagine particular poems without? And if so, which ones played in the background through this collection? I think Manoj will also identify. He listened to so much of Mozart, I think, during his book.
Yes, I mean, it's not that I sat down and listened to things. Well, I actually try not to listen to anything when I'm writing, but I listen as deeply as I can, and then it continues and carries on with me. For instance, in fact, there's a poem called Musk, which has a translation of a line from one of Kumarji's, Kabir's Nirguni bhajans. So it could be like that. I just hear Kumar Gandharva's voice in my mind. There are times when...
So beautiful.
Yeah, so that's one. But there's also Steve Reich, whose work I love. A composition called Runner, which is recent. That's been, in recent months, that's been really playing in my mind constantly. So yeah, Terry Riley, In C, various kinds of Bhairavi Thumris.
Bhairavis and Thumris, so beautiful. Yeah. Okay, everybody says this was a wonderful session. We love the session.
Thank you.
So glad people love the session. Yeah, and I'm so glad personally that you spoke about music. I just loved hearing that. I never heard, you speaking about my loss, of course. But yeah, Preeti, do we have to?
No, I was just saying that there were a couple of questions earlier. From Gurupesh Singh, who's asking, is the poem an image or a theme? Which comes first and what initiates this poem? How do you blend them?
There are different provocations for a poem, I think. Sometimes it could be because you've been thinking about something, very rarely as addressing an immediate theme. But even in Hunchprose, if I go from one page to the next, sometimes it's people in the street that I no longer meet, people who represented traditional occupations, with this strange costumed person who used to come around every Saturday morning with, covered with vermilion and with peacock feathers, a member of a Vasudeva cult. These people have disappeared. So sometimes it's a great absence. I miss it. And that
Saturday.
might be an image that just remains and then connects up with all kinds of other things and then appears, Or it could be like Maitreyi, you were saying earlier, it could be a line in conversation that I totally misheard, but it starts you off in some other direction. So it could be a single image, a single line. That's the gift that comes out of the unknown. And when you work.
And speaking for myself, staying in a city like Bangalore, I miss out so much of that, especially coming from a city like Kolkata. And I've stayed in Chennai also. There are these pockets of traditional elements, that you totally miss out on, and they're completely gone, Anyway, we have, I think, another question. When Derek Walcott was asked by a Newsweek reporter why he wrote in English and not any of the languages of his place of birth, he replied, "Language is not the property of a nation. It is the property of imagination." Is it time we gave up on our fixation or expectations of which language a poet must write in to some extent? Your comments.
I completely agree. And Walcott again came from a place that was extremely complex culturally. So which language was he supposed to write in? Technically, there was a choice of at least 3 or 4 different things, and also depending on what he himself inherited. So, but it points us to this question that I think, Maitreyi, you and I on the sidelines of this were also talking about. What defines a choice of language? I've said this many, many times before, but in India, we've been caught up with a depleting politics of language, where what was traditionally a widely multilingual country is now divided into some sort of linguistic states where everyone's scrambling over the mastery of one language. And I keep thinking, why are we doing this? We have been a subcontinent of migrations, trade routes, exchanges, where, as Sheldon Pollock writes wonderfully in his book, The Language of the Gods in the World of Men, there was no need for a notion of the mother language, of the mother tongue, because many of us, most of us have first language capabilities. It's something that is imported from German Romanticism, the Muttersprache. There's no word for this in any Indian language before. We say Madhuri Zaban, we say Matra Bhasha. These are calques. They're representations of the German Muttersprache, or the English mother tongue. We didn't need that word because it wasn't relevant. And most writers didn't write in their mother's tongues or their family tongue. They wrote in some other formal language that was widely understood or widespread.
And then, of course, there's the whole debate about what Anglophone poets must do and how they must write and how they must not include Indian words. And all of that, it's tiring beyond.
Completely, yeah. Also, my test case for this sometimes is people like, say, Paul Celan, the German, right? He never actually spent too much time in territorial Germany. He was born in Romania and spent most of his life in France. And yet he's one of the greatest German writers. Ungaretti, the great Italian modernist, was born in Egypt and then lived in France, came to Italy at the age of 27. So many of these cherished romantic notions of ours, soil, country, language, there being an absolute unity, this doesn't always work. You make a country your own through your empathy and through your commitments. Likewise, you make a language. This is beautifully said here, as Simar has shared with us. A language is the property of the imagination.
Exactly. But thankfully, I think, at least in the literary circles, things are changing. And I see a lot of the younger writers definitely moving towards finding their own language completely and, owning English in a way that a lot of the previous people who have written previously never probably did. On that note, I think, Preeti, we've kind of completed time, and there are no more questions, I think. So
Yeah, there are just some lovely comments like what an exquisite gift this conversation is. Thank you very much, audience. I think that you've been really engaged,
yeah,
asking
it's
lovely
been a very
questions
engaged audience too. Yeah.
and really listening. So that's wonderful. What, of course, completely stuns me about your poetry and whatever actually speaks to me as poetry, because I'm not such a great reader of poetry because I read a lot of other stuff as well. But it's like everything getting distilled into a poem. So, you know, the very first one that you talked about, um, you know, there's history, there's geography, there's food, there's so much which just comes alive with that one poem. And you can never ever do that with a book, you know. I mean, you've got to read a lot to get it. Here, this for me is the most fascinating thing I think that I've completely enjoyed. Thank you very much, Maitri. But I'm going to now hand over to Professor Gurupdesh Singh to do our formal concluding of the evening.
Before that, Ranjit, it's a complete privilege to, have a chat with you like this. I enjoyed this so much. Thank you for, coming on and speaking so openly about all of this poetry. I wish this book many poetry-loving households, and hope it travels wide.
Yeah, and please, audience, go ahead and order. This is going to be
And
something
please
that's put
also
on the
read
bedside
his
for a long time.
Jonah Vale and Ailala. Those are highly recommended books. Please also read them.
Thank you both so much. It's really been wonderful to be here.
But if you really want me to kind of, say the last word, then I'll say before the last word, I made a request. He should read something from Ailala. Can you do that, Nujit?
Oh my goodness. Okay,
Yes,
thank
please,
you very much
please,
for the,
if you can, yes.
of course. Maybe just one verse.
Yes, all right, that's good.
I have to very quickly look for it. It goes like this. This is a translation of one of Lala's works.
Yes.
What the books taught me, I've practiced. What they didn't teach me, I've taught myself. I've gone into the forest and wrestled with the lion. I didn't get this far by teaching one thing and doing another.
Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you very much. That sums up, in fact, what Lal Ded is. Well, I don't have to make any compliments because I think you have already got the entire chat box flooded with them. I think people have enjoyed it so much and they have found it so informative at the same time. I think your talk has actually informed our listeners or our audience that how poetry is not all about love and probably nostalgia, but it is all about history and culture, and history not about events only, how history actually affects people, how it shapes their mind, how it shapes their lives, and how it shapes the sometimes contours of a country as well, of a whole culture. This has been a great session in that sense. But what I more enjoyed about your poetry was that you are very closely approximating to what they say, the poetry theorists say. The poetry theorists say that poetry is all about gestures. It's only indicative. I think you just make a little hint and the rest has to be understood by the readers themselves. I think your poetry is so full of many images and many references, allusions, which I think readers have to explore on their own. I loved many of your poems. I don't have to do this, but I'll just like to read for my audience here one little reference, one little verse or passage from your poetry, which actually deals with Ramayana. And and I'll just like to inform the group here that how even such a popular story can be made poetic and little distant and unfamiliar to the readers. I'll just read it now. From the anthill came the voice of the golden deer in the forest, the princess carried off by the demon chief, the war, the siege, the giant red monkey cartwheeling across the sky and burning the island fortress. When the war ends, the prince fixes his wife's 14-year wait with a cold state and an ordeal by fire. The fireplace honest witness. I think in these few lines, you would almost hear the whole story of Ramayana if you only know this. And if you are a well-informed reader, I think you probably just enjoy every word of how this poem was constructed. Thank you very much. I think I would in fact thank Preeti and MH for hosting such a top-notch poet of the country. I must say that we had been teaching older poets largely, like Ramanujan and Nissim Ezekiel and others. But I think if there is a course like now on modern poetry, probably your poetry would come at the top, yours and like Shahid Ali. I think these are the people who are now very popular, and they are very representative of the times that we are living in, and they represent our trauma, our daily worries, our angst, our protests. They stand for all this. Thank you very much for running this session and being our guest here. I think our audience is all pleased, all happy. And we have a great word of thanks to you for this, Maja House, for hosting you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And yeah, thank you, Doctor, and thank you, Ranjit.
And please join us next Saturday. We have Ranjit Pawar, who's going to be talking about her novel, which is set in Punjab of the pre-partition days when it was all one big state.
It was indeed a wonderful, engaged.
So we will have that at 6 o'clock next Saturday. Do join us. And thank you very much again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Preeti. Thank you, Ranjit.
Thanks, Maitri.
Bye. Take care.